Hello. Welcome. My name is Derek Mosley. I'm the director of Marquette Law School's Lubar Center for Public Policy Research and Civic Education. And I want to welcome you to our On the Issues program, Expectation of Valor. I have one housekeeping matter to let you know. Federal law mandates that on Veterans Day at 1:11 p.m. I will stop the program for a 2-minute moment of silence for our veterans. So we will stop at that time for the program, just so that you know. We normally run until 1:15, but we will stop at that 1:11 time period. Because it is Veterans Day, at this moment, at this time right now, I would like to acknowledge any veterans who are here in our attendance. If you could please stand and be recognized. Thank you all for your service, and thank you for so much for coming today. Well, let me tell you a little bit about our guest. So, Colonel Kevin Benson served in the U.S. Army for 30 years. He was the director of the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas from 2003 to 2007. Colonel Benson taught at the U.S. Army's Red Team School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas from 2007 to 2017. He was Director of Plans for 3rd U.S. Army and the Combined Forces Land Component Command at the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom. He commanded 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry from 98 to 2000 at Fort Hood. In October 2010, he returned to Baghdad at the request of the commander of U.S. Forces Iraq to assist in planning the conclusion of the U.S. operations in Iraqi Freedom. Colonel Benson graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point. He attended Armor Officer Basic Course, Amphibious Warfare School, Command and General Staff College, and the School of Advanced Military Studies. He attended the MIT Security Studies Program as a War College Fellow in 2001. He earned a PhD in American History from University of Kansas in 2010. He was a Senator Robert J. Dole Fellow at the Dole Institute of Politics in 2011. So please join me in welcoming our guest, Colonel Kevin Benson. So, Colonel, thank you so much for coming.
My privilege. Thank you very much.
Happy Veterans Day.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for that great introduction. I'm at the age now, and I'm sure some folks here appreciate this, that introductions begin to sound like obituaries. So thanks for keeping it short.
You're very much alive, my friend, very much alive. Before I get started, you are actually from the area, grew up in the area.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Tell us about it.
When my mom and dad were married, I was born on the campus of Notre Dame. When my dad was going to Notre Dame for under the GI Bill after World War II, but he moved back to Wisconsin, lived in Milwaukee. We moved to Franksville, and I lived down there until I spent 1 year at JI Case High, and then Dad got a job working for the city of Milwaukee, moved back to Milwaukee, and I graduated from John Marshall High School a long time ago.
Well, welcome back.
Thanks.
Welcome back.
Thanks.
And you've been here for a little bit right now.
Yes,
just visiting.
I've been staying with my wonderful sister and her husband for the past few days. They let me live in their home and bother them, upset their routine.
Well, thank you for that. So, Colonel Benson, I guess I want to start with this picture that we have here on the book. You have to tell me, is there a story behind the picture?
Well, this is the cover of the book, and I have to admit that the wonderful people at Casemate Publishing actually found this photo, and their artists put it together. They graciously acknowledged my suggestions for cover, and thanks very much, Colonel. You stick to writing, we'll do the artwork. and that is, I did as much research as I could do on it. This is. I couldn't find the exact unit, but it's infantry soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Division on the outskirts of what was then Saddam International Airfield during the second Thunder Run that took place when we sent a brigade of the 3rd Division into downtown Baghdad, and then they stayed. which really broke the back of the Iraqi resistance in April of 2003.
So I have to ask, just because we talked about the picture, did you come up with the title? Was that also the publishing
No,
company?
that was mine.
Okay. And why the title?
Well, I was a dilettante historian until I got the formalized getting the PhD. I recorded in my journal that I kept. And it's part of the story that we really had to work with Mr. Rumsfeld to get the forces we felt we needed to come into theater. If you recall, Mr. Rumsfeld was very much into this revolution in military affairs, and he wanted us to do more with less, which is kind of difficult. So we closed on Baghdad very earlier. I mean, I led the war games, and we got to Baghdad, just around 30 days, which was far faster even than I expected. And I recorded one night that I'm afraid that the valor of the 3rd Division and the 1st Marine Division is going to convince Mr. Rumsfeld he was right in restricting the number of forces, which triggered in my mind, and it's in the front of the book, on the 6th of January 1944, I remember this from reading it. George Patton wrote a letter to his son, who was a cadet at the military academy, and it was essentially saying that if you have a plan that has a 50-50 chance of success, take it, because the valor of the American soldier will get you the 1%, so you'll win. And I just thought, expectation of valor.
Love it. Love it. I am going to ask you, if you don't mind, if you would read just a portion of the book, a passage from the book for me. I have it highlighted.
Sure.
Thank you.
So this is the opening of chapter 1, Planning for War. In a theoretical world, planning proceeds in parallel with higher level headquarters, as well as in collaboration with subordinate headquarters. The planning for what would become Operation Iraqi Freedom did not take place in the theoretical world, an understatement to be sure. I confirmed, for myself at least, that the Prussian philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz, was correct. War is a continuation of policy through other means.
And you started your book with that series of sentences. Why did you do that?
Because it really was the realization that in my career, I'd never gone to war before. All the previous fights, I'd been in school or I was in a unit that didn't participate. Grenada, Just Cause, even they weren't fights, but interventions in Bosnia. I just, happenstance, wasn't there. So I had lots of experience in war games, in the controlled fights that we do at the National Training Center or other training centers in Germany and in Louisiana. But I'd never been to war, and I went to war as a colonel. So it struck me that I know this theoretically, and that my experience was vicarious through reading history. And in the School of Advanced Military Studies, we spend a lot of time reading Clausewitz. As we joke, we read a lot of things from dead Germans, and it struck me as I was dealing with sitting in on video teleconferences where I'm in Kuwait, in our secure facility that's inside kind of a bunker, and I'm in my chemical protective gear, and on the other end of the video teleconferences, folks sitting around conference tables in Washington, D.C., the Secretary of Defense is in a business suit, or sometimes he's in rather avuncular. He was wearing a cardigan, drinking coffee, and it's late at night for me, and it's early in the morning in D.C. And it struck me that, wow, I am talking with policy makers, and war really is an extension of policy. It just struck me almost forcefully, honestly, Judge.
So you talked about you had Well, let's do this.
Okay.
I want you to read that passage just because it seems to be a theme that runs through the book pretty solidly. However, that wasn't the reason you wrote the book. Why did you write the book? And this is the juicy part. I like this part.
So I'd kept a journal the entire time. I'd kept a journal most of my career. Actually, it's because when I was a junior officer or lieutenant, and I was keeping a journal, I had to testify at a court-martial, and the prosecutor told me, Kevin, you can bring your journal in because journals are aide-memoire. So that, oh, great. So I kept a journal my entire career, and during my part in the war, I also wrote a daily memo to my boss. So when I came back from Iraq, I figured, boy, I want to write about this. I want to capture what we did. And I wrote a manuscript, and it got rejected, and so I just, okay, I'm going to put it aside. Actually, if I could diverge, my favorite story about rejections in the publishing world, I went to websites, I would follow the page said cover letter, annotated table of contents, who's the audience, who are you, sample chapter, my favorite rejection, and I wish I could tell you who the publishing company was, but I can't remember. I've got it written down somewhere. The rejection came back after about, it seemed, only 15 minutes of review. Somewhat interesting story, not enough violence, no sex. And I just, okay, so at that point I said, okay, I'm just going to let it collect some electronic dust. I went back to Iraq. At the time, General Austin, we went to the West Point together, asked me to come over and help him plan. Actually, it went, Kevin, what is it going to take to bring you back over here? After all, you got us into this mess. The least you can do is come back and help us get out. So I did. Anyway, I came back, and I was invited to go to a conference at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I was told I was going to give a presentation on what we were doing, how we were going to get out, how we would use the monies that were given, that company commanders, battalion commanders could instantly give seed money to small businesses and things like that as a means of trying to reestablish the Iraqi society. And I was preempted by a four-star general, and I knew him too. We were at West Point together. His name was Ray Odierno, and sadly, Ray died a few years ago. A good man, but Ray stands up in front of this audience of diplomats, professors, people who'd been there in the theater, and said that in 2003, ill-informed planners put commanders in positions where they only had bad choices to make. And I almost spontaneously combusted because Ray had been a two-star general commanding the 4th Infantry Division. And when his headquarters arrived in Kuwait, he didn't go see our commanding general, he came to see me. And doing the finger in the chest, when is my division getting in the fight? And so all of that. So anyway, I'm at the conference, and my name tag is like this. And the protocol was, if you wanted to ask a question, turn your name tag up like this, and the moderator will see you. The moderator was a friend of mine, Sean McFarland. He was a brigadier general at the time. And Sean is looking at me going, I'm turning red. I go, okay. And finally, I said, all right. I remember my mother saying, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything. And so I let it go. But I came back to Kansas, and I sat down on my computer and I said, I am getting this book published because I am tired of Army general officers, all of who should know better, that yes, we did plan on what to do after we got to Baghdad. I know, because me and the officers who worked for me wrote it. So that's why I wrote the book too.
I didn't know about the story you just told
Oh,
when we
yeah.
were talking because I had mentioned to the colonel that while I was here as a law student at Marquette, I actually interned with the JAG Corps and was assigned at Fort Carson, Colorado, which is 4th Infantry Division.
4th Infantry.
So when you mentioned 4th Infantry, I was like, I have to stand up for my boys. But
Iron Horse.
Iron Horse, absolutely. So here's the beauty of this book. You don't pull in any punches. You tell your story. And have you had any blowback as a result of that?
Actually, no.
Really?
I think that's because none of those guys are going to read it anyway. But folks who have read it, and I'm very flattered, some of people I really don't know, I know of, have written some very nice reviews. So again, very flattering, and all essentially saying that here's an inside look, that hey, here were people that were grappling with the challenge of what do we do after we get to Baghdad. The president and the administration set 2 policy objectives, and I wrote them they're in the book, but it's essentially a stable Iraq that doesn't support terrorism, doesn't develop WMD, and treats its people well, and then success in Iraq used to convince other nations, Libya, not to conduct WMD and develop nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. And from that, we planners derived, okay, what can the use of force do to establish conditions to attain these policy objectives? And of course, one of those, because we were signatories of Geneva Hague, is when you invade a country, you become the occupying power. And okay, law students, the operational lawyers that we had were, they were, no, you can't leave. You got to stay right here with me because you're going to explain to me all this stuff. What does this Geneva Hague really mean? And essentially it was, we're responsible for making sure the schools get reopened as quickly as possible, that civil services are restored as quickly as possible. I mean, all of those items in our country and our government is a signatory to Geneva Hague. So, our Constitution, we are lawfully required to do that. So, Benson, planner, we're going to figure out how to get what does as soon as possible mean. And that was part of our war gaming. So that's what it was tough. Yeah,
I bet. I appreciated this. I don't know if anyone's told you this before, but as you know, in the military, everything's acronyms, and there are a million acronyms in this book. But I appreciate that you put the glossary in the front, which makes it a lot easier to go back instead of trying to get all the way to the back to find the glossary. Was that done on purpose?
Yes. I asked the editor to do that. Actually, what I asked to do was, could we make the glossary a fold-out page? Because I tried to reduce them as much as I could, but it's part of the military language. And the editor was great. He said, or she said, "Kevin, that's wonderful. Of course we can do that. It'll cost you $5,000." And I had to pay for it. I thought, okay, but we can put the glossary up front. Oh, of course we can. Okay, good.
It's an excellent book, and I do enjoy the fact that you do break down those acronyms. But there's a story you told me when we talked, and it's also present, that you finally get there, and someone hands you a note, and you thought it was a joke. You read the note. Could you tell that story?
Sure. I was in Boston on 9/11, going to school at MIT. So I had the luxury of sleeping in a good bed, drinking good beer, not being under any pressure, spending time with my wife, going to really great classes. And when I arrived at my headquarters, Third Army in Atlanta, Georgia, in July of '02, all of the folks who'd worked in the plans section had been working 12, 16, 18-hour days since 9/11. And I came in and I asked to meet my lead planner, whose name was Lieutenant Colonel Tom Riley. And Tom came in, and Tom had bags under his eyes. I mean, he was bone weary. And we shook hands. We'd never worked together before, but we were both graduates of the School of Advanced Military Studies, so a shared educational experience. And I said, you know, Tom, great to meet you. Who's working on what we do after we get to Baghdad? And Tom just looked at me, and he shook his head, and he had a piece of paper in his hand. And I said, well, wait. He said, we're not working on that, boss. Well, Tom, what are we working on? And he handed me a piece of paper, and it was a Xerox of an inter-office memo. Honest to God, not making this up. There were 2 sentences on it. We have a brigade, 5,000 troops, on the ground now, period. Why can't we go now, question mark. Signed, Wolfowitz. And my first response was, and just rolling in my head, was I thought, I'm brand new, he is dog tired, and he's busting my chops on day one. This is fabulous. This is my kind of outfit. I love this place. And I laughed. And Tom was just, and I said, okay, Tom, this is great. I love this planner humor. I dig it. But seriously, I am the colonel. What are we doing? And he just, sir, that is what we really are working on now. Because when the Office of the Secretary of Defense or the White House asks a question, that becomes job one. It doesn't matter what you do. You have to answer that mail as fast as possible. So that's what we're working on.
And the theory was, and I think you mentioned in the book, is that everybody thought it was just going to be we're going to go in, maybe we just drop some bombs, so no one gets hurt, and we get right out.
Yep. House of cards is what I heard on a video conference before I deployed overseas. It's going to be a house of cards. And when I went back to my group of planners and I said, oh, good news, fellas, Washington thinks that Iraq is a house of cards. And one of my planners, Evan Helfer, a great officer, Evan said, but sir, what if it's built around a bowling ball? Like, okay, well, that's why they have us, man. So, the way we answered, why can't we go now, was, and this is what all of us who were educated as planners, it's the science or the arithmetic of war. So the way we answered, why can't we go now, was we said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to calculate how much it takes to move one tank the 600 kilometers from Kuwait to Baghdad, expecting moderate resistance along the way. So how much fuel, how much ammo, how much water, how much food, spare parts, God forbid, a casualty. So what does it take to evacuate the casualty? To show that 5,000 soldiers in a brigade does not have near enough trucks to move all the stuff you need. So here's just for one tank. Now multiply that by 600. And that's the cheeky response that I sent. But I never got any feedback on my cheeky response. And again, I think that's because the generals that I was working for were real busy too. And they trusted me to, okay, Kevin, you got that, you answer it. Roger. So.
And you used to receive, you mentioned these emails from the White House and Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
You gave it a nickname because so many were coming. What'd you call it?
We called them snowflakes because they came out of the Secretary's office like a blizzard. And so the snowflakes would land. Mr. Rumsfeld's a really interesting guy. And I don't say anything about He's intelligent. He's a remarkably intelligent man, but he was a man of fixed opinions. And so his war experience, even though he'd been a Navy pilot, he'd never been to war. And his war experience was Afghanistan. And Afghanistan fell in a matter of days because there were really brave Special Forces soldiers riding horses, putting laser dots on things, and the Air Force is just in vulnerable altitudes dropping bombs all over the place. And that, forgetting that there were some 65 or 75,000 Northern Alliance Afghan soldiers who were on the ground too. So, but that was the war experience. There's only a handful of Americans. Well, we ought to be able to do that. There's 5,000 Americans there now. Let's go. It's going to take more than that.
Now, you were put in charge, now this is just for those who aren't aware, you were put in charge of the Land Command. Do
Yes.
you have an equivalent for air and sea as well?
Oh, absolutely. The way that the theater, or General Frank's joint force was organized, there is a land component, an air component, a sea component, and a special operations component. And those subordinate headquarters were in charge of, my headquarters was in charge of the conventional ground forces, the Army and the Marines. And of course, the Air Force coordinated all of Navy Air, Air Force Air, the Brits who were flying, anybody else who was contributing fighter aircraft or bomber aircraft. Same with the Navy. Fifth Fleet was coordinating all of naval operations. And then there were the special operations guys who delighted in telling me, you don't have a need to know what we're doing, Kevin. It's like, you only jumped out of an airplane 13 times. You're not cool. Oh, I love those guys. They really are. That's another whole story. And so there were counterparts. I knew who my counterpart was in the air and the Navy and the special ops. So forgive me, now I'll segue. The first time I met my air counterpart was shortly after I got to Atlanta in the spring of 2002 into the summer. General Franks periodically would convene what he called his component commanders conferences. And the general for whom I worked took me along. Every time he went somewhere, I went somewhere, because I was his planner. And General Franks was in this conference, and Franks, I'd served with him before when he was a lieutenant general. I would have jumped in front of a bus for Franks. I mean, he's such a good man. And he came across as such, this earthy, aw shucks, Texan sort of guy, slapping backs, but he was sharp. He really was. So we're at this conference, and the General Franks makes some comment to my boss, whose nickname was PT. PT, I expect you to, come and ask for the 82nd Airborne Division to do things. And General, the general, his name was Mike Leshek at the time, looked over his shoulder and said, I got this, boss. Because I'd been a planner in the Army's Airborne Corps too. So I was spinning wheels. Okay, 82nd, how many airplanes we need, where's it going to go, all that kind of stuff. And I was looking forward to meeting and talking with my air component brothers and sisters. Well, at the same time, my lieutenant general sitting next to the Air Force lieutenant general, whose name was, of course, all Air Force officers who were fighter pilots have nicknames or call signs. So Lieutenant General Buzz Mosley.
It's a great last name.
Yeah, it is. It is. I think you're cousins.
Yeah.
My boss hands a piece of paper to Mosley. And then General Franks says, it's time for a break. And I don't know what's on the paper. I'm just scribbling notes to myself. I'm getting ready to get up to walk over to the Air Force guys and gals. And I watched as Mosley was a proud, powerful man like me, follically challenged.
Me too. It runs in the family, apparently.
And I watched it from the bottom, from the nape of his neck. His head turned red all the way over the top. And he turned around and he fixed his gaze on me. And I will not say what he said, but he handed this piece of paper to who I learned was my counterpart. Now, Al Wickman, great man, said, look at this malarkey from CFLC, CFLC, Combined Land Forces Component Command. Again, there's that acronym, essentially from the Army. And Al grabs it, and now there's an Air Force huddle. And they're all, mutter, 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 Army. And it's like a mole would pop up, Army, expletive deleted, Army. And so I walked up to him, I said, okay, time out. What's up? And Al turns to me, hands the paper, and said, where are your credentials to be an air planner? So I take the piece of paper, and I had no idea what it was. And it was a printout of an email. Now at the time, the operations officer, I was a plans officer, the operations officer for 3rd Army, his name was Mike Haverlack, H-A-W-V-Y-L, it was a very proud Polish name. And my commanding general's name was Mike Leszek. But so it's from Haverlack to Mike Leszek. And I'm reading it, and it's about how we should get the Air Force to do things for the ground component and blah, 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 all that warfare speak. But my name wasn't on anything. And so I said, okay, everybody, stop. And I held it. I said, Haverlack to Mike Leszek. And then I pointed to my name tag, Benson. And so now, okay, they laugh, and so we shake hands, and it's, okay, boys and girls, we're all the planners. You're never going to be surprised. I'm going to keep you informed about what us ground pounders are doing. But, you have to expect me to represent my boss, just like you're going to represent General Mosley. Yeah, everybody's laughing. And by that time, the Navy and the Air Force planners come over too, because everybody enjoys seeing the Army Air Force firefights. It's really entertaining. And so now we're all laughing, all the planners, okay, we got it, I'm meeting everybody. And I literally turned around and bumped right into General Mosley. And of course, Mosley is still ticked off. He wouldn't talk to my lieutenant general. So here I am, a convenient target. And he's looking at me, and then he starts, and I don't know why people do this to me, but he's pounded me in the chest. And again, I'm not going to lapse into barracks language, but Franklin, Army, where are your credentials to our air planning? I don't tell you how to check the tire pressure on a Humvee, blankety blank, Army, blankety. And I went, General. He did the same thing. Haverlack, Mike Leszek, Benson. And it stopped him cold, and he looks, and he laughs, and he goes, and again, blankety blank, well, Benson, you blankety blank, you're okay, but don't ever tell me how to run the air war. Like, okay, General. Warfare is also about personality. I'll just leave it at that.
I was waiting for it. Leave it at that. Okay.
Oh, after I got to the headquarters, the lieutenant general in command, Lieutenant General Mike Leszek, he changed command. The Chief of Staff of the Army wanted to put his chosen commander, the chief he could do that. He's the 4-star, he runs the whole Army. So my then boss, Lieutenant General Dave McKiernan, was assigned. And I'd known McKiernan since he was a lieutenant colonel in Germany and I was a major. And he'd been my division commander at Fort Hood, Texas, when I commanded a battalion. So, I knew him, he knew me, it was fabulous. And what our Chief of Staff also did was 3rd Army at the time, the senior staff officers were all colonels. And so General Shinseki directed that we're not going to go to war like that. We're going to have general officers as the staff principals. The experience, the ability to be able to talk up to central command and talk back to, it's one thing for a colonel to get cheeky with another colonel, but a colonel doesn't get cheeky unless he or she has, wants to commit career seppuku. with lieutenant generals, even major generals. So we had the staff that were the principal leaders, the intelligence officer, the operations officer, the supply officer, a deputy commanding general, a Marine major general as the chief of staff came in, and these guys were called, go figure, the dream team, because these were the Army general officers were the absolute best guys by acclaim. I knew every one of them. They were superstars. And it was fun to work with them. They all came down to Atlanta, and General McKiernan did me the great honor. I mean, seriously. All these guys are again, in the vault inside the secure facility, because we're talking about our invasion plan, which at the time was, burned before reading classified. And I'm going to give the presentation. And I was fully expecting that, well, if all of my brother colonels are getting replaced, I'm probably going to be the deputy planner. And McKiernan started out by saying, I'm glad you guys are all here. We got a tough job ahead of us. Kevin is staying as my planner. I'm not bringing a general in. And I'm like, where's the grenade? I'm jumping on it for you. So I'm empowered in front of these guys. So I'm sorry, this is a Shaggy Dog story.
No,
okay.
It's fine.
So what this leads to is how do now Kevin Benson, who is on the wire diagram, the equivalent of the three major generals, the intelligence officer, the operations officer, the supply officer, and then there's me. And so can I be cheeky? Sure, a little bit. But we always would, the operations officer, a great guy. He retired as a 4-star general. His name is J.D. Thurman. And J.D. was about my height, but built like an NFL, middle linebacker. I mean, big chest, big arms, and he's a Southerner. And so he never could figure out why me as a colonel wasn't working for him. And I would just tell him, it's because our boss said, I don't work for you, JD. And there's some stories in the book that we'll go into more detail. Same with the intelligence officer, who is a great friend of mine. His name is Spider Marks. He's one of the military talking heads on CNN. Spider's tremendous intelligence officer. But Spider always was like, I'm a major general. I said, I know, I can see your stars. I was like, you better respect me. I do. Throw a sir in there every once in a while. Okay. Just Spider. It's just under the pressure of war. All of us were in the galley rowing in the same direction. And it was interesting to me. I'm sure that the folks who worked for me could tell the same stories about me. But all of us were under pressure. All of us wanted to perform, and we didn't want to let General McKiernan down. And so I just became a convenient release valve for all that.
But that statement that you just made comes through in the book. The statement that you just made about the people who worked for me probably had the same stories about me. Because that's what's so great about the book. What's great about the book is that it's not like you write in this book, Rumsfeld and these guys did all this wrong. Yeah. I had all the right answers. You acknowledge in the book, we made mistakes. Yep. You acknowledge it. And I think that's what lent some credibility to the book as well. So I appreciate
Judge.
Because I just wanted to catch that because you just said that and you could see it in the book. You also mentioned before that you are an avid journal writer, and this book is essentially your journal entries.
It is. It absolutely is.
That's how detailed. When you read the book, you're going to see how detailed his journal entries are because they're pretty detailed. So before I want to open this up, before we get questions, but I just had to ask. You mentioned that you hadn't really been in war before, and now you're planning a war. What did you draw upon?
And again, it was my previous professional education, my personal continuing professional education. Ever since Sister Louis Bertrand taught me how to read, I became dangerous. And then the experience I had up until that time. Your Army, veterans, you know this, we don't just march around in circles and salute. I mean, we train for war. And it's not under wartime conditions, but so I felt when I was given that assignment, I felt that I was ready, that I'd prepared for this, and I was, it's not where I wanted to be. In my dreams, I'd always wanted to be, in the lead tank, leading my troops into battle, but that's not where I was called to be. So, yeah.
Another book?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I do have a dissertation that friends of mine are urging me to turn into a book. Boy, that's hard. And I have, this is where I get my journal keeping genes. And my sister knows, I have my grandfather's World War I journal. So it's over 100 years old now. And in my mind, it's Charlie Benson's War. And trying to figure out how I could do that. But I don't know. I don't know. I also have to help my wife take care of her mother, and that takes a lot of time.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I'm going to open up to questions because I told you before we will be stopping early to acknowledge the our moment of silence. Yes, please. I think we could. We have a microphone coming to you in the back.
I'm a graduate of Texas A&M, which a lot of people don't know, but we produced more officers than all the academies put together, which was one of the things when I went to A&M back in '54. Two things I got out of it, got a lot more out of it, but chain of command and RHIP are two major things, I think, right?
Indeed.
Rank has its privilege.
Yes, absolutely, sir. But that's, our armed forces are a hierarchical organization. And that's the way we are. And officers who are in command are vested with the authority and the responsibility for the decisions they take. So I was a staff officer. My job was to make sure that my commanding general had, had as nuanced of options for the invasion and for continuing operations as I could develop with the planners. But planners do not take decisions. I present options for a commander to take decisions. So rank does have its privileges, but it also has its responsibilities.
You talked about the logistics of getting a tank from Kuwait to Baghdad. You cited food, water, gas, and spare parts. I'm curious, I could figure out the first three, but spare parts, how do you make that calculation?
It's an amazing thing that Fort Leavenworth puts out. It's called the Staff Officer's Guide. And it's based on historical results of studies of parts usage and the mean time between failure that we get from the manufacturers of the tanks, of the engines on tanks or compressors, for example. And that gives us a rough estimate it's an estimate of when we think parts are going to break down, and therefore what do we need to carry in the prescribed load list of immediately available parts. What does that same list of equipment mean at a higher echelon of maintenance? And again, it comes back to all it takes is, it's how many trucks do you have? Because all of that stuff has to be moved by truck. So that is all becomes, and so you see there where it gets into that's why I called it the arithmetic of war, because trucks also break down, and we have to have spare parts for the trucks. So it's an amazing table of that's in a book, and now it's computerized, that will allow us to, when we do our estimates, to make really detailed estimates. If we expect to advance 600 kilometers, we know the mean time between failure for the engine of an M1 tank is this, therefore we're going to need X number of replacements, we're going to need Y number of air filters and things like that.
Did you factor in the desert environment?
Absolutely, that's part of it. Because the historical factors include North Africa, as well as the central region of Europe during World War II. It also factors in, what the Pacific and adjusted for Korea. So cold weather, hot weather, desert, temperate climates, rain. It's pretty sophisticated stuff. Well, it's detailed and it's painstaking work. That's why I thank God for computers, because we can put some parameters in and then find out. And again, these are all estimates, because you don't really know what's going to happen. But it gives us an edge of talk about, because again, part of what we have to do too, part of the logistics process is getting to the theater of war. So for example, the 4th Infantry Division is at Fort Carson, Colorado. So part of the effort is, how many trains does it take to move the entire 4th Infantry Division from Fort Carson, Colorado to the port of Beaumont, Texas? How long does that train trip take? How many ships of a certain class will it take to load out the division? How long does the loadout take? How many airplanes are we going to need to start sending troops over to Kuwait, while leaving enough to load the ships, and then can let those guys catch up? And it goes on like that. So, for example, and forgive me for a long-winded answer, but when Mr. Rumsfeld, the feedback we were getting was the request for forces went up to him for the 4th Infantry Division. And this is when, oh wait, let me put the map up. Sorry, I'm not doing it right.
Let me see if I can get that for you. Make sure it's on. Oh, it's off.
Oh, turn it on, Kevin. So, and again, forgive me for belaboring the point, but the 4th Infantry Division, no laser on that, was going to come in northern Iraq, and they were going to go in through Turkey. So how do you figure that out? And then it was the assessment of the port in in Turkey they were going to go into was deep, but not deep enough for the current class of ships we were using. So we had to go to the reserve fleet, activate a different kind of cargo ship. So that had to get spun up. And then the 4th would go into the port. And now how does it get from that port, the 1,000 miles to the the get off the train point in northern Iraq? Okay, well, it's got to be trains. So you see, it was that level of detail that we were doing to marry up not only the consumption of food, water, ammo, medical supplies, spare parts, but also the linkage of transportation assets. Yes, sir.
One last question. Didn't Turkey turn you down?
Yes, sir.
So how much time did that take to recalculate and get those that were going through Turkey?
I don't think we have enough time for me to answer that question. It was a lot. We had guys, see, and again, war is an extension of policy. Well, the Turkish government, we can't just land there and say, hey, Turkey, how you doing? And we're going to drive through your country. The Turkish government had to allow us. Well, the Turkish parliament said, don't want to play. So, okay. But all that time, around the island of Cyprus, all the cargo ships were loaded with the 4th Infantry Division. And so now they have to go through the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandeb, come around the peninsula of Saudi Arabia, go through the Straits of Hormuz, all the way up, where I'm going, and then come to Kuwait and get off the ship. That was why I was Ray O'Dearna when my office pounded me on the chest saying, when is my division going to get in the fight, Kevin? I said, well, so in February of '03, I was asked, Kevin, when should we start the 4th Division moving so they can cross the line of departure from Kuwait? And again, this is one of my cheeky moments. I said, 3 weeks ago? Because, the other thing, and again, forgive me for just getting all excited. One of the things that people would always poke me and go, Benson, think outside the box. And my answer was, My box is bounded by Newtonian physics, on which it takes time to move mass over distance. Now, so what can be controlled from Washington will be controlled from Washington, even if it can't be controlled from Washington. Forgive me for a long-winded answer, sir.
No, it's a great answer.
On the cover of your book, I was looking, and the bottom line has the name of the gentleman who wrote the foreword to your book. Could you tell us about that individual and why you chose him to write the foreword?
Yes, sir. Retired four-star General Vince Brooks sat right next to me as Captain Brooks when we were both students in the School of Advanced Military Studies. Vince and I had known each other since West Point, even though I was a senior and he was a freshman when we went through. So just a really good friend of mine. And Vince had also served in Central Command headquarters, during the opening part of the war. So he saw what I was seeing, but from a different perspective. And so I reached out to my friend Vince and I asked him, would you write the foreword to my book, Vince? And he said, sure, KB. And he said, what do you want me to say? And I said, Vince, I've been real cheeky, but I'm not going to tell you what to say. You can say whatever you want. So that's what. Thanks for asking. Vince is a real good friend of mine. A great soldier, great man.
Are there any U.S. forces still occupying Iraq?
We are not occupying Iraq, but there are 2,500 or so American soldiers still in Iraq, and about 800 American soldiers still in Syria.
And to be honest, what was accomplished by this invasion?
Well, and I admit I'm a little biased, but it sounds a little weird, but Saddam Hussein is no longer in charge of Iraq, and he was a miserable man, and he suppressed those people really badly. And the effect then is that the Iraqis are achieving I believe, an Iraqi form of democracy. They have freely elected all of their leaders since we captured and the Iraqis then executed Saddam Hussein. I think that's the best thing that came out of it. I will tell you the other thing too, and this is not, and again, this is Kevin Benson's personal opinion. When I went back in 2010 to help plan on how to depart, President Bush and Prime Minister Maliki had made an agreement that the United States forces would leave Iraq at the end of 2011. President Obama said that's a government-to-government agreement, we are going to leave. The United States was the first invading power in the history of that region to depart in accord with an agreement with an Arab government. And any U.S. forces who are still there are there under the auspices and agreement and the request of their government. We do not impose. We are there at their request and with their support. So that's what we got out of this, I believe. I do.
Okay, we've got one more.
Colonel, I'm just curious, what consideration was given during the planning process, if it was by you or your G2, to the historical occupation of Iraq by the British during and after World War I? And I confess I'm a Navy commander who was an intel officer in UCOM during the time.
Hayes grade underway. Sir, on my desk, the books that I brought with me, I brought the memoirs of Sir Glubb Pasha, the British officer who was seconded to the Arab Legion in the post-World War I period. I had a book, The Arab Mind by Raphael Patai, and, well, a couple other books that were, one of them was called, It Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time, Major Failures in Military Planning. We, as deeply as I could, I dug into the history of the region, the Arab culture writ large, the specifics of Iraqi culture, vice Saudi, vice Jordan and Syria. We had officers who were, their specialty was called foreign area officers. You understand where I'm going with that? And there were Arabists that were engaged in our planning. There was one fella, he was a television commentator, a retired colonel, and I gave him my word I would never reveal it and what he told us specifically. But from talks with him, he was the guy who suggested to me that the two institutions in Iraq that preceded the Ba'ath Party and Saddam was the bureaucracy and the army, both established by the British after World War I. And so we leaned on that. We tailored our information operations so that we would tell the irregular army, we're not here to fight you. We're here to get rid of Saddam. And if you don't want to fight us, here's the signals to send. To the Ba'ath Party, we were saying, remember the Vince standing there with the deck of 52? That was sort of another big...
I'm going to ask you to pause for a
Right.
second at 111 so we
Right.
can do our 2-minute moment of silence. All right, thank you. You want to finish that thought?
Well, I completely forgot. Sorry, I'm getting old. I know we've got just a short period of time. So, law students in the room? Any? Okay, thank you. You all, especially if you come into the service, but in the Army, you're going to run into folks like me. And we are going to come to you and we are going to ask you, Judge, what do you think? And we're really going to mean it. Because when we were putting together our plans, too, remember I said Geneva Hague. Hey, Judge, what does this really mean when it's as soon as possible? How can we refine that? Work with me. Rules of engagement. Because when we crossed into Iraq, not many of those troops had ever been in war. And that will always be the case. The young men and women who are manning the tanks and the artillery pieces and the infantry squads, that'll be the first time they've ever put the rifle to their shoulder and put it down and put the bead on another human being. And we have to communicate to them the necessity of rules of engagement, especially when you're fighting irregulars and they're not wearing a uniform. And, hesitation sometimes is a good thing, But other times when that knucklehead is coming around the corner, he's got an AK-47 and he's drawing a bead on you, who shoots fastest wins. I mean, I'm serious. It really comes down to that. So when us non-lawyer types who come to you and go, okay, Judge, what can we do? We're not just pumping sunshine at you. We really want to know. We really do.
Can we give our guest, Colonel Kevin Benson, a round of applause?
So thank you.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Judge.
it.
Just two things that we have coming up. November 18th, next Monday, we have our Native American Heritage Dinner featuring chefs from Top Chef Wisconsin. And on the 21st of November, we have our post-election program. So we hope to see one of those or both of those. Thank you so much.